He was born in 1901 when Japan was still a rising empire. He saw two world wars, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the surrender of Japan, and its rebirth as an economic miracle. Emperor Shōwa, better known to the world by his personal name Hirohito, was the longest reigning emperor in Japanese history. He ruled for 62 years. By the time of his death in 1989, he was not just a symbol of Japan. He was a living witness to some of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. But when he died on January 7, 1989, the official story was simple. Emperor Shōwa had suffered from cancer of the duodenum, part of the small intestine. He had endured months of internal bleeding, weight loss, and multiple blood transfusions before he finally passed away at the age of 87. Yet many questions remain. What really caused his death? Was it just old age and disease? Or did stress, guilt, and the heavy weight of history play a role? In this video, we explore not just the medical reasons behind Emperor Shōwa's death, but also the hidden factors: his secret suffering, the psychological toll of World War II, and the way his health reflected the struggles of a nation. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you may see the death of Emperor Shōwa in a completely new light. Chapter 1: The Final Illness. By the summer of 1988, Emperor Shōwa's decline could no longer be hidden. For decades, the Japanese public had seen him as a figure of endurance, rarely missing ceremonies, always appearing calm and dignified. So when he suddenly began canceling public duties, whispers spread across the nation. Something was terribly wrong. Doctors later confirmed he was battling duodenal cancer, a dangerous illness located in the first section of the small intestine. For a man in his late 80s, treatment was nearly impossible. Surgery was ruled out, chemotherapy considered too harsh. What remained was only management, transfusions, medications, and quiet suffering. In September 1988, his condition worsened dramatically. Internal bleeding forced an emergency hospitalization, but official announcements were vague, carefully worded to avoid panic. Updates such as His Majesty remains in serious but stable condition became a daily ritual, leaving the nation in suspense. Behind closed doors, his struggle was harrowing. He required dozens of blood transfusions, sometimes several in a single week, because his body could not produce enough to replace what was lost. His once upright figure became skeletal, his face pale, his movements labored. Yet even in weakness, secrecy ruled. In Japanese tradition, the emperor was more than human. He was a symbol of continuity. To admit vulnerability was to risk shaking national confidence. Thus, his suffering was hidden behind careful words, his true pain known only to doctors and close attendants. Finally, on January 7, 1989, after months of decline, Emperor Shōwa passed away. His death did not simply mark the loss of a man. It closed the curtain on the Showa era, a turbulent chapter that had carried Japan from empire to ashes, and from ashes to prosperity. Chapter 2: Cancer and the Burden of Secrecy. To understand the secrecy surrounding Emperor Shōwa's illness, we must first understand the role of the emperor in Japanese culture. For centuries, the emperor was more than just a ruler. He was considered a sacred presence, a living symbol of the nation's spirit. To admit weakness, frailty, or disease would be to shatter that image. When Hirohito was diagnosed with duodenal cancer, the imperial household agency kept details hidden from the public. Doctors were strictly forbidden from making direct statements. Even the media tiptoed around the truth, using vague expressions like "His Majesty is unwell" or "His condition is delicate." The word cancer itself was avoided, as though speaking it aloud would dishonor the emperor. But outside the palace walls, Japan was already facing a medical reality. By the late 1980s, cancer had become the leading cause of death in the country. Millions of ordinary Japanese families were struggling with it. The emperor's illness reflected not only his personal decline, but also a broader national crisis of health. Lifestyle may have played its part. Hirohito's duties demanded long hours of official meetings and ceremonies, often stretching late into the night. He was constantly hosting banquets where his diet included heavy, rich foods. Unlike younger men, his aging body could not easily process such meals. On top of this, there was the crushing burden of stress. For more than 4 decades, Hirohito carried the memory of World War II. Though spared from trial as a war criminal, he was never free from blame. Abroad, he was criticized as the man who led Japan into conflict. At home, he remained both revered and questioned. Every handshake with a foreign leader, every newspaper headline about the war reopened old wounds. Medical science tells us that long-term stress weakens the immune system, slowing the body's ability to fight disease. For Hirohito, this constant psychological pressure may have given cancer the advantage it needed. So was his cancer purely biological? Or was it the final weight of history pressing down on him, punishment, not from medicine, but from memory itself? Chapter 3. The Shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hirohito's final illness cannot be separated from the shadow that haunted his reign, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In August 1945, Japan faced its darkest days. 2 cities were obliterated, more than 200,000 lives lost within weeks, and countless more scarred by radiation. For the first time in history, the emperor made a direct address to the Japanese people. His radio broadcast was quiet, poetic, and almost otherworldly. He did not use the word surrender, but his meaning was clear. Japan must endure the unendurable. To his people, this voice was both a shock and a comfort. Most had never heard him speak. Yet behind that calm tone was a man crushed by the weight of responsibility. Hirohito had presided over an empire that dragged Japan into war, leaving cities in ashes and millions dead across Asia and the Pacific. After the war, he escaped trial as a war criminal, thanks to U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, who believed preserving the emperor would stabilize Japan. Still, many around the world saw Hirohito as guilty, the symbol of Japan's aggression. Inside Japan, he remained a contradiction, sacred to some, quietly resented by others. For more than 4 decades, Hirohito lived with this tension. Every state visit brought reminders. When he met U.S. presidents, European kings, or Asian leaders, silent questions lingered in the air. What role did you play in the war? Could you have stopped it? Doctors later noted that Hirohito's health often faltered when public debates about war responsibility resurfaced. The connection was clear. His body weakened under the strain of memory. Medical science may call his death the result of cancer. But emotionally, spiritually, perhaps it was also the delayed consequence of August 1945, the burden of 2 mushroom clouds that never left his shadow. Chapter 4. The Body of an Old Emperor. By the late 1980s, Emperor Shōwa was no longer the resilient figure who had once stood at the center of Japan's transformation. At 87 years old, his body was frail, worn down by age and decades of relentless duty. He had already endured earlier health scares, including chronic digestive problems that hinted at the vulnerabilities inside him. Now, cancer had found the perfect conditions to take hold. For someone of his age, treatment options were limited. Surgery was far too dangerous. The risk of not surviving the operation was greater than the chance of recovery. Chemotherapy was considered, but his doctors feared it would destroy what little strength remained, leaving him weaker than before. What remained were only temporary measures: pain relief, careful monitoring, and endless blood transfusions. These transfusions became a symbol of his fight. Each one bought him a few more days, sometimes only hours, but never offered a cure. At times, he required multiple transfusions within a single week. His once strong, upright frame became frail and skeletal. His presence reduced to the fragile image of a man clinging to life. For the Japanese people, his illness was not just medical news, it was a national drama. Television stations broadcast daily updates. Newspapers printed front-page reports on the smallest changes in his condition. Outside the imperial palace, citizens left flowers, lit incense, and prayed for his recovery. Some wept openly, while others stood silently, fearful of what his passing might mean. Because Hirohito was not only a man, he was the living bridge between Japan's imperial past and its modern identity. His decline reminded the nation that even emperors could not escape mortality. His final struggle mirrored Japan's own anxiety about change, aging, and the future. Physically, Emperor Shōwa's body was giving way. Spiritually, the nation was holding its breath. His death would not just end a life, it would close an era, one that had defined Japan's darkest defeats and greatest recoveries. Chapter 5. The Guilt of a Monarch. Here's a haunting question. Can guilt kill a person? For Emperor Shōwa, guilt was not a fleeting feeling. It was a shadow that followed him for the rest of his life. He had signed off on Japan's expansion into China and Southeast Asia. He had stood by while generals launched brutal campaigns in Nanjing, in Manila, in countless battlefields where civilians suffered and soldiers died. And when Japan finally surrendered in 1945, Hirohito never issued a direct confession of responsibility. His famous radio speech spoke of enduring suffering, but not of his own role in causing it. Historians say that silence became his greatest torment. Behind palace walls, he occasionally spoke to close aides of regret. He admitted wishing he had done more to stop the suffering, or at least softened its blow. But his words were always private, never public. He carried his remorse quietly, like a weight he could not put down. Psychologists tell us guilt is not just an emotion. It's a physical burden. Long-term guilt raises blood pressure, strains the heart, and weakens the immune system. It eats away at health, leaving the body vulnerable to disease. For Hirohito, every reminder of the war was another spark that reignited his guilt. Every foreign visit, every history book, every protest against Japan's wartime actions cut into him like a wound that never healed. So perhaps his cancer was not only a disease of the body, but also the manifestation of decades of inner conflict. His spirit was eroded long before his organs began to fail. When he finally passed in 1989, many said he died of cancer. But another truth may be this: he died of the slow poison of guilt, a monarch who carried the sins of an empire until his last breath. Chapter 6: A Nation in Transition. When Emperor Shōwa finally passed away in January 1989, Japan did more than lose a monarch. It crossed a bridge into a new era. His son, Emperor Akihito, ascended the throne, and the nation officially entered the Heisei era, which meant achieving peace. But what many Japanese people remember most was not the ceremony of succession, but the surreal atmosphere of Showa's final months. Hospitals released daily bulletins about his condition, and these updates dominated newspapers and television. Every fluctuation in his blood pressure, every treatment, even reports about his bowel movements, became national news. For a figure once regarded as semi-divine, this level of exposure was extraordinary. It stripped away the mystique, reminding the public that even an emperor, the living symbol of the nation, was in the end human. His prolonged decline gripped the nation. Citizens left flowers outside the imperial palace. Some prayed for his recovery. Others quietly braced for the inevitable. His suffering seemed to echo the nation's own story. The Showa era had been filled with extremes: catastrophic defeat in war, followed by a miracle of economic recovery. Japan had risen from ruins to become one of the richest nations on earth. Yet now, in the twilight of the 1980s, cracks were showing. The country faced new challenges: an overheated economic bubble that threatened collapse, mounting social pressures, and a rapidly aging population. In many ways, the emperor's fading body mirrored Japan's anxieties, prosperous on the surface but fragile underneath. So when he died, it was not only the death of a man. It was the symbolic end of an era that had defined modern Japan. His passing carried a message. The age of rapid rise and survival against the odds was over. The nation was entering a new chapter, one that would test whether peace and prosperity could endure without the memory of hardship to bind it together. The death of Emperor Shōwa was not only an end, it was also a warning. Chapter 7: The Medical Mystery. Officially, the cause of Emperor Shōwa's death was listed as duodenal cancer, complicated by relentless internal bleeding. That was the medical record, the official explanation. But behind those words lies a cloud of secrecy and speculation that continues to puzzle historians and the Japanese public alike. From the very beginning of his illness, the Imperial Household Agency controlled every detail released to the press. Bulletins were vague, wrapped in ceremonial language. Doctors rarely spoke directly, and when they did, their words were carefully chosen. It wasn't just medical discretion, it was cultural tradition. For centuries, the emperor had been seen as more than human. Revealing the ugly details of disease was considered undignified, almost sacrilegious. But this secrecy left many questions unanswered. Why did it take so long to reveal that it was cancer at all? Some historians suggest that the illness had spread much earlier than announced, but the agency delayed acknowledgement to preserve the image of strength. Others argue that doctors refrained from aggressive treatment not just because of his age, but because tradition demanded it. The emperor was not to be treated like an ordinary patient. Then there's the theory of psychological decline. Hirohito had lived with decades of guilt, stress, and depression tied to the war. Stress is not just an emotion, it can break down the body's defenses, allowing illness to spread faster. Was his cancer accelerated by the heavy burden of memory and responsibility? We may never know the full truth. What we do know is that his final months were a slow, painful journey, prolonged by transfusions, shrouded in secrecy, and carried out under the watchful eyes of an anxious nation. In the end, Hirohito's death was not sudden. It was a long decline, one that forced Japan to let go not just of a man, but of the Showa era itself, an era of war, defeat, and rebirth, finally closing with his last breath. Chapter 8. The Death of an Era. On the morning of January 7, 1989, Japan came to a standstill. Factories slowed, traffic quieted, and television screens across the nation displayed somber faces. News anchors, their voices trembling, delivered the historic words, "His Majesty, the Emperor, has passed away." The Showa Emperor, the man who had guided Japan from imperial expansion through catastrophic defeat and into dazzling economic recovery, was gone. Immediately, flags were lowered to half-mast. Crowds gathered outside the imperial palace, some in tears, others in stunned silence. For many, it felt as if time itself had paused. His funeral, held weeks later, was unlike anything Japan had seen in modern times. It became one of the largest state ceremonies in world history, attended by dignitaries and leaders from more than 160 nations. The sight of presidents, kings, and prime ministers bowing before the emperor's memory revealed how deeply his reign had marked the 20th century. Millions watched on television, both in Japan and abroad, witnessing the farewell to a figure who had embodied an entire era. For Japan, his death closed the Showa era, an age defined by both unimaginable destruction and extraordinary rebirth. For the world, it marked the passing of the last emperor who had ruled during the Second World War, the final link to an age of empires and global conflict. Medically, Emperor Shōwa died of cancer. But history tells us his true death was from something greater, the crushing weight of memory and responsibility. He carried with him the shame of defeat, the guilt of war, and the pride of recovery. On that January day, the man who bore Japan's heaviest burdens finally laid them down. An emperor died, but an era ended. Conclusion: the last great emperor. So, what truly caused the death of Emperor Shōwa? On the surface, the answer is medical. Cancer of the duodenum, worsened by age, weakness, and unstoppable bleeding. But history reveals a deeper truth. His illness was not only of the body, it was also of the mind, the heart, and the spirit. He was the emperor who witnessed Hiroshima's destruction. The emperor who, with trembling voice, surrendered in 1945. The emperor who carried the unspoken guilt of war, yet also the emperor who stood, as Japan rose from rubble, to become one of the world's great economic powers. Few rulers in history ever bore such extremes. By 1989, his body could no longer shoulder the burden of memory. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the closing of the Showa era, a chapter that began with empire and conquest, passed through the fire of war, and ended with peace and prosperity. Even today, Emperor Shōwa remains a figure of controversy. Some honor him as a leader who guided Japan through recovery. Others remember him as a silent witness to unspeakable suffering. But whether respected or criticized, he was the last emperor to embody both the glory and the tragedy of Japan's 20th century. On January 7, 1989, an old man's body gave way. But with him also died an era. An emperor fell, and history turned its page.